The end was a quiet thing, a slow surrender to the cold that had seeped into her bones and frozen her will. An Lee lay curled in the narrow alley, the rough brick wall a final, indifferent companion. Snowflakes, delicate as lace, settled on her worn beige prairie dress, a garment so thin it offered no more warmth than a memory. Each breath was a shard of ice in her lungs, each heartbeat a faltering drumbeat counting down her last moments. She had traveled across an ocean for a dream, a promise of a new life, only to find herself discarded like refuse in the frozen filth of a strange town. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness gather at the edges of her vision. It was easier to let go. If you've ever felt the icy grip of despair, the kind that makes your own heart feel like a stranger in your chest, then you know the sound her breath made in that frozen alley. It was the sound of a flame sputtering out. Then a shadow fell over her, vast and solid, blocking the weak gray light of the winter sky. A pair of enormous boots, caked with snow and mud, stopped just inches from her face. Her gaze traveled upward, past legs thick as tree trunks, over a broad chest covered in thick buffalo hide, to a face framed by a wild mane of dark hair and a beard just as untamed. He was a mountain of a man, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the very air from the alley. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were surprisingly gentle as they took in her shivering form. He knelt, the movement slow and deliberate, and the scent of pine and cold, clean air filled her senses. She expected him to walk away, to leave her to her fate as everyone else had. Instead, a deep voice, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, broke the silence. "Get up," he said, the words simple, yet carrying an undeniable weight of command. Her body wouldn't obey, her limbs locked by the cold. He saw her struggle, the faint tremor of her eyelids. "You're coming home." He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he cradled her against his massive chest. The warmth from his body was a shock, a sudden, searing contrast to the numbing cold that had claimed her. Tucked against him, her head resting on the solid wall of his shoulder, the world dissolved into a blur of motion and the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart against her ear. Her mind, untethered from the immediate struggle for survival, began to drift, pulling her back into the fractured memories of her journey. She remembered the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold, the taste of salt and fear on her tongue, the hopeful faces of the other girls who had shared her dreams. They had all been promised good work, a chance to send money back to their families. The promises had turned to dust the moment they arrived. She had been sold into servitude to Sheriff Brody, a man whose smile was as cold as the gold coins he counted with avaricious glee. He had worked her to the bone, his compliments as false as his promises. When a winter fever had taken hold of her, leaving her weak and unable to work, he had cast her out without a second thought, tossing her meager wages at her feet with a sneer. "I have no use for a sickly thing," he had spat, his words more chilling than the winter wind. She had wandered the streets, her pleas for help met with suspicion and scorn. She was an outsider, a ghost in a town that saw her as less than human. The alley had been her last refuge, a place to lie down and let the world fade away. The man carrying her now was a stranger, a giant from the mountains, yet in his arms, for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a fragile, tentative warmth, a tiny ember in the vast, frozen landscape of her despair. She didn't know his name or where he was taking her, but the steady beat of his heart was a lullaby, a promise of something she had long since given up on, a chance to live. The cabin was small, a single room built from sturdy logs nestled in a grove of pine trees at the foot of the mountains. Inside, a fire roared in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow that danced across the wooden walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, and something else, something savory and comforting. The man, who she learned was named Finian, laid her gently on a cot near the fire, covering her with a thick wool blanket. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his large frame surprisingly graceful in the confined space. He brought her a bowl of steaming broth, his calloused fingers brushing against hers as he handed it to her. She flinched at the contact, a lifetime of caution ingrained in her every nerve. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and set the bowl on a small stool beside her. "Eat," he said, his voice softer now. "It will warm you." An watched him as she sipped the broth, the warmth spreading through her, chasing away the last of the deep, biting cold. He was a man of few words, his actions speaking volumes. He tended the fire, checked his traps, and moved about the cabin with a quiet purposefulness that was both reassuring and intimidating. She was a stranger in his home, a burden he had taken on for reasons she couldn't comprehend. Fear, a familiar and unwelcome companion, began to creep back in. What did he want from her? Why had he saved her? The world she knew was a place of transactions, where every kindness had a price. As the days bled into one another, a quiet routine settled over them. Finian would leave at dawn to hunt or check his lines, and she would be left alone in the quiet solitude of the cabin. She began to heal, the fever receding, her strength slowly returning. Yet, with her physical recovery came a new kind of anxiety. She was living on borrowed time. Sheriff Brody was not a man to forget a debt, real or imagined. He would see her as his property, and he would come for her. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter outside. The knock on the door came a week later, a sharp, authoritative rap that shattered the peaceful quiet of the cabin. An froze, the mending in her hands falling to her lap. Finian, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, looked at her, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp with a sudden alertness. He rose to his full height, the rifle held loosely in one hand, and moved to the door. He opened it just a crack, his body blocking the entrance. Sheriff Brody stood on the threshold, his polished boots a stark contrast to the snow-dusted porch. Two of his deputies flanked him, their hands resting on their holstered pistols. Brody's eyes, small and hard like pebbles, scanned the interior of the cabin, landing on An. A cruel smirk twisted his lips. "Well, well," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality. "Look what the mountain cat dragged in. I've been looking for you, girl. You owe me for breach of contract." An shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Finian didn't move. "She owes you nothing," he said, his voice a low growl. "She was sick. You threw her out to die." Brody chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "That's my business, not yours, mountain man. Now step aside. The girl is coming with me." He made to push past Finian, but the big man was an immovable wall of muscle and resolve. "She's not going anywhere," Finian stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "She's under my protection." The air crackled with tension. Brody's face hardened, his hand inching towards his own weapon. "Are you challenging my authority?" he sneered. "I'm telling you to get off my land," Finian replied, his eyes like chips of ice. "Now." For a long moment they stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Brody looked from Finian's unwavering gaze to the rifle in his hand, and then back to the two nervous deputies behind him. He was a bully, accustomed to his authority going unchallenged, but Finian was not a man to be intimidated. With a final, venomous glare at An, Brody turned and stalked away. "This isn't over," he snarled over his shoulder. The threat hung in the air long after he was gone. The confrontation with Sheriff Brody marked a turning point. The immediate danger had passed, but the threat remained, a shadow lingering at the edge of their peaceful existence. In the days that followed, a new dynamic settled between An and Finian. The fear that had kept her guarded began to recede, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning trust. She started to see the man behind the imposing facade. She saw the way his large hands could be surprisingly gentle as he stitched a tear in his coat, the quiet concentration on his face as he read from a well-worn book by the firelight, the deep well of loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He, in turn, began to see her, not as a victim to be pitied, but as a woman of quiet strength and resilience. He watched as she slowly reclaimed her life, her movements becoming more confident, her voice gaining a new clarity. She began to help with the chores, her small, nimble fingers proving adept at tasks he had always fumbled with. She cooked for them, transforming his simple rations into flavorful meals that filled the cabin with the aroma of home. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, their lives intertwining in the shared space of the small cabin. Their conversations were often quiet, punctuated by long, comfortable silences. He told her about the mountains, the changing seasons, the language of the forest. She told him about her home, the village she had left behind, the family she missed with an ache that never fully subsided. They were two solitary souls, finding solace in each other's company. The cabin, once just a shelter from the storm, became a sanctuary, a place where the wounds of the past could begin to heal. It was in the small, everyday moments, the shared smiles over a warm meal, the quiet companionship by the fire, the unspoken understanding that passed between them, that the seeds of something deeper, something more profound than gratitude or protection, began to take root. As Anli's physical strength returned, so too did her spirit. The woman who had huddled in the alley, ready to surrender to the cold, was slowly being replaced by someone new, someone forged in the crucible of hardship and tempered by kindness. She was no longer content to simply survive. She wanted to live. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she spoke of the other Chinese workers in the town, men and women who were trapped in the same cycle of exploitation she had escaped. She had heard their stories in hushed whispers, tales of docked wages, brutal working conditions, and the constant threat of deportation. Sheriff Brody was at the center of it all, a spider in a web of corruption and fear. "He cannot be allowed to continue," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Someone has to speak out." Finian looked at her, his expression serious. "It's dangerous, Anli. Brody is a powerful man in this town." "I know," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "But I cannot stay silent. To do so would be to betray those who are still suffering. It would be to betray myself." He saw the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine, and he knew she was right. His instinct was to protect her, to keep her hidden away in the safety of his cabin. But he also recognized that true protection wasn't about caging her. It was about empowering her to fight her own battles. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet respect. She told him her plan. She had a small ledger, a gift from her father, where she had secretly recorded the discrepancies in her wages, the extra hours she had worked without pay. It was small proof, but it was a start. She wanted to go into town, to confront Brody not with anger, but with the undeniable truth. She wanted to give a voice to the voiceless. "I'll stand with you," Finian said, his decision immediate and absolute. "Whatever you choose to do, I'll be by your side." In that moment, their bond deepened, transforming from one of protector and protected to one of true partners, united in a common cause. They rode into town 2 days later, the winter sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. The town was quiet, the biting wind keeping most people indoors. Anli's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She clutched the small ledger in her hands, its worn cover a small comfort. They stopped in front of the general store, the largest and most frequented establishment in town. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, was a kind man who had shown her small kindnesses in the past. It was here, in the heart of the community, that she would make her stand. Sheriff Brody was inside, holding court near the pot-bellied stove, his laughter booming through the store. He saw them enter, and his face soured. "What do you want?" he demanded, his eyes fixed on Anli. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople who had stopped to watch. With Finian standing solid and silent behind her, she stepped forward. "I have come to speak the truth, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a newfound authority. She opened the ledger. "You cheated me. You cheated all of us. You promised fair wages for honest work, and you gave us lies." She began to read from the ledger, her voice unwavering as she detailed the stolen wages, the broken promises. A murmur went through the crowd. Brody's face turned a mottled red. "Lies!" he roared. "She's a lying, ungrateful foreigner." But Anli didn't back down. She met his furious gaze with a calm dignity that unnerved him. "I am not the only one," she said, her voice rising. "Ask the others. Ask them about the conditions they endure, the fear they live in." At that moment, Mr. Abernathy stepped forward. "I've seen it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've seen how you treat them, Sheriff. This girl is telling the truth." Another voice joined in, then another. The tide of public opinion, so long held in check by fear, began to turn. Brody, stripped of his authority and exposed as a cheat and a bully, stood isolated and condemned in the court of public opinion. His power, built on intimidation, crumbled under the weight of one woman's courage. They left the town in a triumphant silence, the setting sun painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of orange and pink. The moral victory was a balm to Anli's soul, a cleansing fire that burned away the last vestiges of her fear and shame. Back in the warmth and safety of the cabin, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly faded, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. They ate their dinner in a comfortable silence, the unspoken emotions hanging in the air between them, as warm and inviting as the crackling fire. After they had cleared the dishes, Anli went to the small window, looking out at the star-dusted sky. The mountains stood as dark, silent sentinels against the night. Finian came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, comforting warmth at her back. He didn't speak, simply stood with her, sharing the quiet moment. "Thank you, Finian," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." He turned her gently to face him, his large hands cupping her face. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, his touch sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "You did that, Anli," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That was all you, your strength, your courage." He looked down at her, his stormy eyes filled with an emotion she had never seen before, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and a deep, aching vulnerability. "I've lived alone in these mountains for a long time," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was content. But then you came. You filled this empty cabin with life. You filled my life with light." He leaned down, his gaze searching hers, asking a question his words could not form. Anli's heart soared. She rose on her toes, her hands coming up to rest on his broad chest, and met his lips with her own. The kiss was hesitant at first, then deepened into a passionate expression of all the unspoken feelings that had grown between them, a silent promise of a future they would build together. Their love, now confessed, settled into a deep and abiding companionship that transformed the small cabin into a true home. They knew, however, that their bond, while profound, was not yet secure in the eyes of the world. Sheriff Brody, though disgraced, still held a position of authority, and his resentment simmered just beneath the surface. For Anli to be truly safe, to truly belong, they needed a more formal, public declaration of their commitment. It was Finian who proposed it one morning as they watched the sunrise paint the mountain peaks with gold. "Marry me, Anli," he said, the words simple and direct, yet holding the weight of his entire heart. Let me give you my name. Let me make this your home, officially and forever." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, at this giant of a man with a heart as vast and true as the wilderness he called home. He was offering her more than just a name. He was offering her a place in the world, a family, a future free from fear. Her "yes" was a soft, heartfelt whisper that he sealed with a gentle kiss. They were married a week later, on a crisp, clear winter morning. Mr. Abernathy traveled up from the town to act as their witness, his face beaming with genuine happiness for them. The circuit judge, a stern but fair man, performed the ceremony on the porch of the cabin, the snow-covered mountains their cathedral. Anli wore a simple dress she had made herself, and in her hair she had woven a sprig of evergreen, a symbol of their enduring love. As they exchanged their vows, their voices clear and strong in the cold winter air, Anli felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer a castaway, a piece of driftwood on a hostile shore. She was Finian's wife. She was home. The legal document they signed was more than just paper and ink. It was a testament to their love, a shield against the world, and a declaration that she, Anli, a girl who had once been left to die in an alley, had found her place, her purpose, and her forever love in the heart of the wild mountains. A year passed, the seasons turning in their inexorable cycle. Winter returned to the mountains, blanketing the landscape in a fresh, pristine layer of white. But this winter was different. It was not a season of cold and despair, but one of warmth, contentment, and a deep, abiding love. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, but a home, filled with the sounds of their shared life, the crackle of the fire, the soft murmur of their conversations, the easy laughter that came so often now. Anli stood by the window, just as she had a year before, watching the snowflakes drift down from the gray sky. She traced a small heart on the frosted pane, a smile gracing her lips. She was no longer the frail, frightened girl who had arrived here on the brink of death. She was a woman who knew her own strength, a woman who was loved fiercely and who loved in return. She felt strong arms wrap around her from behind, and she leaned back into Finian's solid embrace. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his beard tickling her neck. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low, comforting rumble in her ear. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to frame his rugged face. She looked into his eyes, those stormy seas now calm and filled with a love that was her constant anchor. "I was thinking about the first time you brought me here," she said softly. "You told me I was coming home." He nodded, his gaze tender. "And was I right?" A radiant smile spread across her face, a smile so bright it could have melted the snow outside. "You were," she whispered, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so immense it left her breathless. "I'm home." He lowered his head and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss filled with the promise of all the winters yet to come. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of pure, silent white, but inside the small log cabin, two hearts beat as one, a testament to the enduring power of love to heal, to redeem, and to create a home in the most unlikely of places.